Welcome to a short discussion on topic 1. For this particular recording, I'd like to start by taking a look at the textbook and showing you a few things that some of the students have said were helpful for them. So what I've done is I've gone into my bookshelf, and here's my textbook. You probably have something similar. And this is the Public Health for Community Resilience book that's for P-Core 501 for fall semester. So if I click on that, it takes me to the actual textbook, and there are some things here along the left-hand side that can be very helpful for what we're doing. If you are in a tablet, these things probably are along the bottom of the screen instead of being along the left-hand side. The home button literally just takes me back to that same library, and so if I was switching between books, that would be helpful. And these other buttons down here can do some interesting things. So for example, here I can search for something specific within the book. Here, these three horizontal lines that are different from the horizontal lines above, down below, these three lines will give me a table of contents to the textbook. And depending on what kind of app or PC or tablet you are in, it will look a little bit different. Sometimes the little arrow will be to the left of the book in order to open up more table of contents. And so just look around the actual heading of the book to see if you can open up what I'm going to open. In this case, we have the little arrow here to the right, and it shows me the 6 different textbooks that are included in this ebook. For this particular topic, we are interested in epidemiology, and specifically, if I click here on this right arrow, we're interested in Epidemiology Chapter 4, which is titled Descriptive Epidemiology, Person, Place, and Time. So within that chapter, there are even subsections, and you'll notice that you have the introduction, the main sections, the conclusion. There are the SQEs, or the study questions and exercises, that you have a learning guide. It prompts you to do a few of those exercises. There are also references. And if I go back to the epidemiology textbook overall, within end matter, let's go ahead and go here. In Appendix B, there are some answers to some of those questions, and the ones that seemed helpful, I've tried to give those to you. Unfortunately for Chapter 4, there are none. It goes 2, 3, 5. Some of the chapters lend themselves more to this than others, and so you'll just have to look back there and see what kinds of questions you can find. So specifically for Chapter 4, we are really looking at person, place, and time. And so let's start off by thinking about what is, for this review video, what is descriptive epidemiology? And I like to use words that are common so that people can kind of help to differentiate. With the descriptive epidemiology, what we are trying to do is we are trying to describe. And by describe, that's where the person, place, and time comes in. With person, place, and time, we are describing things like who. Place describes where. So if we're answering these questions, time answers the question when. So if you think of the who, what, when, where, why, descriptive epidemiology is really looking at the who, the where, and the when part of that. And so we are simply describing who this group is. Maybe it's a population, maybe it's a city or a country, but we are describing. So descriptive epidemiology is just trying to describe what percent are in what category, what proportion maybe has this morbidity or mortality. So we're just simply describing. Now, if we were to take that and say versus analytic epidemiology, analytic epidemiology is not what we're studying here. Analytic epidemiology is looking at cause. And so we're looking at the cause of, or the why. Why are people having this particular disease? What are some of the things that are maybe associated with it? If we look at the causal pathways, why would that cause that particular thing to happen? So they're related because we're saying maybe who is it that has this particular condition, or who is part of this population, what percent is male and female, the causation would say, well, why are there more women than men? Is it that the men are dying in war? Is it, what would be the cause for that particular thing that we are noticing in descriptive epidemiology? And so that deserves a little bit of a discussion about the kinds of studies that we do. Often, when we're thinking about epidemiology, we go along a continuum, and we start out by case studies or case series. So we're looking at just individual cases, things that make us notice. We're all really epidemiologists. We notice things that are around us. But then we move on to cross-sectional kinds of studies. And so in these cross-sectional studies, these are really our surveys, where we're just collecting information from somebody in a single point in time, and it has its own strengths and limitations. We'll be talking more about that. These two kinds of studies really are the basis of descriptive epidemiology, because then as soon as we have some more information about what it is that we're studying, if we've generated some hypotheses, then that's where we move into case control studies, and or we may also look at cohort studies, like prospective cohort, retrospective cohort. And then the gold standard of studying relationships really is clinical trials, or trials. I'll just say trials here. And so often the progression of people learning about things starts with noticing with a case study or a case series, moving on to some kind of a survey, doing a cross-sectional survey of some kind, be it an ecologic study or studying individuals, and then we start trying to figure out what's causing this thing that we're noticing. So descriptive epidemiology, not a hard and fast rule, but tends to live in these early parts of our epidemiologic investigation of something. An analytic that looks at causation tends to live in this later part. And there is some overlap. They are not neat silos that are separate, but we tend to progress along this spectrum as we're doing epidemiologic studies. So let's look a little bit about, now that we've oriented ourselves to descriptive epidemiology, at this whole concept of person, place, and time. And so with person, we are looking at who these individuals are. With the place, we're looking at where this particular phenomenon is happening. And time really helps us look at things that are happening at different times, either in relation to each other or relation to a calendar, so that kind of thing. So the who really is captured in this person part of our textbook. So if we were to look back here, let's, okay. So let me find what I'm looking for. There are a few things in this chapter that I would really like to point out. First of all, on page 177, we have the whole discussion, and this is 177 of the EPI textbook, so at the top of the page it should say a 177. There's an exhibit 4.1 that really goes into the whole idea of race ethnicity. And the thing with race ethnicity is that it's a very complicated thing that we measure. And sometimes it's used as a surrogate, sometimes it represents something like culture or how people see the world. And the place that we've come to at this point is that we generally have about 5 categories that most studies use. First of all, we look at the difference between Hispanic and non-Hispanic. And so we have a category Hispanic, And then the rest of the categories fall under non-Hispanic. And so we have Hispanic, non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, and then we have often what we call Asian Pacific Islander. It's implied here that these are non-Hispanic Asian Pacific Islander. Sometimes we'll have Native American Alaskan as another category, but generally we include that with a category called other. So we end up with these groups that are supposed to be mutually exclusive. Other might include things like multiracial. But the thing that I'd like to point out here is that before we start talking about white, black, Asian, Pacific Islander, Alaskan, blah, 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 all that other stuff, we first pull out Hispanic. And it's because historically the Hispanic populations, the Hispanic groups that are studied, tend to have some really unique protective factors. And so they may be Hispanic and Caucasian. They may be Hispanic and black. They may be Hispanic and other kinds of combinations, just depending on the heritage of that particular country. But Hispanic, even after they've been in a country for quite a long time, for generations, they tend to continue to have this protectiveness for them. I also want to address a little bit the notion of white and black and that kind of thing. There are people who will argue that maybe African American is a better term, that it's very complex and different groups will use different things. I'm using the terms that the census data uses, that a lot of government reports use. And if you see other ones, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just shows that we have a really hard time finding the right words to say exactly what it is that we're trying to say here. And so there's not an implication about the value of a person, but we're trying to capture something here by looking at race ethnicity. So that's on page 177. Another thing that I wanted to point out that's in the book, actually is a few pages back, and this is on page 172, the age-adjusted cancer death rates for men and women. And this is something that you should become very familiar with. We should, as a class, look this up. The most current information that we have, I think, is for 2000. I think we do have 2015 at this point. I would have to double check and see. But what this shows is we're looking at mortality rates or death rates, mortality meaning death, from these different causes specifically for cancer. And you'll notice some very important trends. You as a public health practitioner needs to be familiar with cancer trends. And more specifically, you need to be thinking about the causes behind those trends that you see. For example, in the top figure, 4.4-5, you'll see the age-adjusted cancer death rates for men by cancer site. And you'll notice that we had this peak for lung and bronchus around 1990. It went as high as it possibly has ever been. And so back in the 1930s, cancer from lung and bronchus was relatively uncommon compared to other things such as colon cancer and stomach cancer and things like that. So why did we see this huge rise? Well, I think everybody knows sort of the obvious reason is from cigarette smoking. And then the next follow-up question is, why do we see this steep decline? And a piece of that is that we have a lot better, sorry about that, I'm getting a message on my phone, is that we have better cancer treatment, more people are quitting smoking, maybe fewer people are taking up smoking. So there are just this wide variety of reasons that we can see for changes. We also, another thing that you'll probably notice on here is a blip for prostate cancer in the 1990s, early 1990s, and then it started to taper off again. And sometimes that could be just a change in the way we look at things, our surveillance system. And so it became very popular to start testing PSAs. For that reason, if somebody died and they had a diagnosis of prostate cancer, it would make its way onto the death certificate often as one of the causes of death, even though prostate cancer very rarely is the cause of death. So these are some of the kinds of things that when we look at something like this, we really want to see the why. One of the other things you'll notice is for lung and bronchus cancer for women, they do also have a similar increase. However, it's later than for men. And so we're thinking, why would it be for men it's so much earlier? And I think in many cultures in the U.S. this would also be true. That lung cancer or the smoking really took off for men earlier than it became popular for women. And so we also see the decrease for women at a later time. The peak happens more like 2000 or the early 2000s, and then it starts to sort of taper off. And so we have these interesting phenomenon. It would be interesting to look at, why is it that we have a decrease in stomach cancer? Why do we have a decrease in colon and rectum cancer? And so just thinking about those kinds of things when you look at data for kind of this descriptive epidemiology. The third thing that I would like to point out in this particular chapter is they have brought up a really interesting specific case on page 199. So go ahead and go to page 199. And this has to do with looking at the different hypotheses of why we tend to see mental illness in the lower socioeconomic strata of this society. And so you may have noticed this yourself, that people who are poor, maybe homeless, and other kinds of things, they have a hard time keeping a job, those kinds of problems, and leading to the lower socioeconomic strata. We notice that there's a lot more mental illness there. And so there are a couple of competing hypotheses, and the thing that I would like to point out about these is that they are really sort of the opposite ends of the spectrum. One of the hypotheses is that if a person is born into kind of like a lower socioeconomic status, just because they are subject to more stress and things that happen in their life as they're progressing, that it's those kinds of experiences bring out mental illness. And so it's the socioeconomic status in that case that causes or contributes to a person becoming mentally ill, say depression or schizophrenia or things like that. The other hypothesis is that if a person has those illnesses, the either depression or schizophrenia or other mental illness, that it causes them to drift down into those lower strata of socioeconomic status. And so this is the opposite. It's the mental illness causing the lower socioeconomic status rather than the lower socioeconomic status causing the mental illness. And so you can see how in many situations we need to be aware of how things move in both directions. And so this whole breeder hypothesis versus downward drift hypothesis, this is kind of the directionality. And descriptive epidemiology doesn't really look at that, but if we are using descriptive epidemiology as a way to form hypotheses, then we need to think about the kinds of hypotheses that we're going to form. So that's something to think about. The next section in the textbook really talks about the where, the location. And one of the things that this chapter points out, does a good job of pointing out, near the end of that section, after it talks about a variety of different kinds of things that are differences, is what are the reasons for these place variations in disease? And if you think about the kinds of reasons that we might have for these differences, first of all, it could be an artifact. It could be that we are just measuring it differently in different locations. The other explanations are that it really is truly different in those different areas, and it's due either to the differences in society and the people who live there. There are different kinds of people who live in different locations, or that there's something in the environment that's really influencing people. So we have this society slash person kind of reason that we have these place differences versus environmental. And so keep in mind that when we notice something, it's not always true. It might just be that we're measuring it differently in different places or different times. So that's kind of the where issue. The next section really talks about characteristics of time. And in this section, there are some important terminologies. And so I want you to make sure that you're familiar with them. A lot of times people are like, I'm in graduate school, do I need to really memorize definitions? And so let me go off on a little tiny bit of a tangent in that. Whenever you learn a new topic or area or learn about a profession, one of the things to keep in mind is that you are learning the language of that profession. So now that you're in public health, you need to learn the language of public health. So when somebody says, like, one of the characteristics of time is cyclic fluctuation, if somebody were to say that, really what they're doing is they're using that as shorthand for something that's a much larger concept. And so if you're in public health and you don't have the terminology to be able to have a knowledgeable conversation, then you're going to really be limited. If somebody uses a word that you're not familiar with, then that's going to be limiting to you. So there are some important key terms that are in this section, such as cyclic fluctuation, point epidemics, secular time trends, clustering. There's even later on, there's something called common source epidemic. If you aren't familiar with those terms, then become familiar with them. And a lot of times one of the easiest ways to learn something like that is to come up with an example. So let's say you wanted to learn about common source epidemic. Well, give an example of either in the literature or something that you have had in your own personal experience where there was a common source epidemic. Common source epidemic could come from, say, a church picnic or a Christmas party or places like that. If you think about cyclic fluctuation, often a common one that we think about is infectious disease. There are certain seasonal patterns that happen throughout the year where the common cold is more common in certain time frames of the year and that kind of thing. And so the terminology here in this when section and providing examples for yourself so that you really understand what each of those terminology type things mean, that's going to be what you should probably focus on. So that really, those are some of the kind of important things to focus on as you're reading through that particular chapter, chapter 4 in epidemiology. So then let's move on and think about the chapter 5, which is the sources of data. Oops, I'm trying to get to it. Sources of data for use in epidemiology. And in this particular chapter, you're literally given a whole bunch of different examples of data sources. And so how do you kind of like narrow this down to what's the most important thing to really focus on? And so here, I think there are some pretty basic ideas because they've only listed a few data sources. They've only really mentioned a lot of the ones that are super relevant to public health, but then there are also a lot of other kinds of data that you may be coming in contact with as you're going through your career. So if you think about these data sources in terms of what kinds of data sources there are and what kind of data that provides, for example, these special surveys a lot of times will provide information about population health. Vital statistics provide information about birth and death. Disease registries provide information about whatever those registries are involved in, such as cancer. So those are the kinds of things to think about. Being able to say, what I need in order to answer this particular question is I need a disease registry on that particular disease. Or to answer this question about birth and the kinds of things around the birth experience, I need vital statistics. I need birth certificates. So understanding that those sources and where to find data. Also, for each of those kinds of data sources, each one of them has advantages and limitations. And so the advantages and limitations are going to be what tells you how you can use that data. And so an advantage of, say, census data is that we think we've captured nearly everybody in the United States by including them in the census. A lot of times we are really only trying to capture just a small sample of people and have that represent the whole entire population. And so certain data sources have specific advantages and limitations. A limitation of the census data is that we only collect it every 10 years. And so if we're 8 years away from the last time it was collected, it might not be very current. So it's so expensive to do something like a census that we really don't always have the most important information. So we talked about sources. Here, let me type advantages and limitations. Of each kind. And then it's also helpful if the textbook gives you certain things like NHANES or HHANES. Those are examples of what kind of a study, what kind of information. So a cancer registry, that's an example of what. So that a lot of times providing yourself with an example will help you to remember the specific details about that kind of a data source. So really looking at those kinds of things for data sources, you won't be asked to memorize every single one and know exactly what variables are measured in each kind, not to that kind of detail, but just being very familiar in general with the kind of data you can find out there. And so before we end this video, I just wanted to show you a couple of things in terms of, I just Googled San Bernardino County statistics, and you'll come up with all different kinds of things. You want to go to places that seem like they're legitimate, SB County, census.gov, those would be good sources of information. And so these really are kind of the who, what, when, or who, when, and where kind of information. On this particular example, this is telling us the where and the when as a general over topic of the entire report. So the main thing that they're going to be telling us in this report, this community indicators report, is the who. So tell us about San Bernardino County in 2014. And if we were to go down here to the table of contents, you can see the kinds of things that they look at. They look at employment, the business climate, transit, educational areas, community health and wellness, public safety such as crime and gangs, environment, we're looking at both energy and the environment, how polluted or how clean it is, and then even community life. So these are the kinds of things, the who, that we're looking at in this particular report, because we already know the where and the when. In terms of this one, the San Bernardino County, California, census.gov, this is telling us for a specific year the kinds of information that we can find, the population estimates, and they do these population estimates mid-year for a particular year, so July 1, 2015, so that hopefully we'll find the average for the entire year. And then you can look at some of the data that you can find in this particular area. You can also ask more information about that particular estimate. Age and sex, race and Hispanic origin, and so these are some of the kinds of things that are talked about in your particular chapter of the textbook. So these are the kinds of information that you would be engaging with, the data sets that you would actually need to be familiar with and be able to extract the data that you would need once you're out in your career. So that concludes this short introduction on chapters 4 and 5 in epidemiology, the descriptive epidemiology and data sources. Thank you for joining me.